today we're going to be talking about academic language. It's something that many of you, if you've spent a lot of time on your edTPA, you realize it's a pretty significant portion of your edTPA. There's a lot of questions in your edTPA that have to do with academic language. It seems pretty clear that those two babies knew what they were saying to one another. We maybe didn't know what they were saying to one another, but it was pretty obvious that they did. In your undergraduate work, in your work before student teaching, how many of you talked about academic language? That's not bad. That's not bad. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you, or if some of you, haven't talked explicitly about academic language. But when we talk about it today and figure out what academic language is, you'll probably think, well, actually, we did talk about how to teach and make sure that we are addressing academic language in our classes. So hopefully, even if we haven't gone over that with you in some of your classes before student teaching, hopefully it will be familiar. The edTPA talks about academic language as the oral and written language used for academic purposes. It's the means by which students develop and express content understandings. Academic language represents the language of the discipline that students need to learn and use to participate and engage in meaningful ways in the content area. You've spent 4 years, 5 years, maybe even more, developing the specific language that is important for you to be successful in your specific content area. You've spent a lot of time learning the vocabulary, learning the way you talk about your discipline, learning that when you read about your discipline, what you need to look for. You've spent years doing that, but the students that you teach, in many cases, have not. So when they come into your math class, into your social studies class, into your health class, for them, the specific language that's necessary to be successful, not only in your content area, but in school in general, is unknown to them. And it's very difficult for students to be successful in math if they don't even understand all of the language, the academic language, that goes along with being a mathematician. And what academic language really is, and why the edTPA really emphasizes academic language, is because it's about accessibility. It's about providing equal opportunity to every student who's in front of us so they can learn our content, so they can be successful in school. And so to see all of this language function and language demands and all of these things on the edTPA seem like, wow, where is this coming from? It is very important, and it'll be important for you in the years ahead in your teaching profession to make sure you're always thinking in the back of your mind, am I making this content accessible to all my students, even though they don't maybe come from a background where academic language is used all the time. Academic language allows students to understand your material, allows them to communicate with each other and with you and on standardized tests. It allows them to perform in ways that are important to show that they know your material. And it's necessary to participate in the content. It's necessary for them to be able to ask you the right questions, for them to participate, if they have and have access to the academic language. This is a great quote from an 8th grade student. School is where you go to learn a secret language. But they don't tell you it's there. You have to figure it out on your own. It's like an initiation to a secret club. I bet with all of your years of schooling and now that you've been in the schools, there have been times where you've sat in on a class or in on a meeting and you realized you really weren't sure what was going on. You're listening to the vocabulary, you're listening to abbreviations, they're showing you charts, and you're not understanding it. And maybe part of the people in the room are nodding, they get it, and you're feeling like, I missed something. Sometimes students feel like that, you know? Wait a minute. That teacher just used an abbreviation. That teacher just used a formula. That teacher just told us to look at a table. A table? That teacher just asked us to discuss a certain content, and I don't know what that means. And suddenly they're at a disadvantage. They feel like it's a secret language that they don't necessarily have access to. So you probably noticed some of these words in your edTPA. I personally have found in learning about academic language that it's harder for me to describe it, but it's easier for me to show it to you. So I found a few videos from the teaching channel, and I'm going to show them to you in a second, so you can look at what I mean when I say discourse and syntax and vocabulary. Because I think when we see it in teaching, then we know, oh yes, that's what it is. Oh, I've done that. Oh, I've made sure that I talked about syntax. But I think it's harder to describe and easier to see. So we're going to look at some videos in a second. But some of the different terminology that comes from your edTPA that maybe felt unknown to you around academic language was language demands, language function, vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. Do you recognize these from the handbook? Yeah. So when they say language demands, that's sort of the overriding term. The language demands. And that's everything. That's what are the language functions that you want students to be able to perform. What do you want students to be able to do related to the language? What is the vocabulary? What is the syntax? What is the discourse? So that's sort of the overriding overriding term to refer to language functions, vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. So what do I mean by language function? Language function is the learning task. It's usually represented by the action verb within your learning objective or outcome. So think about the objectives and outcomes you've written. The students will discuss. The students will describe. The students will analyze. Think about what we mean when we say analyze. And what might that student think, or maybe not know at all, when we say analyze. I want you to go back to your desk, and I want you to analyze. To them, that language function, they don't know what you want them to do. They don't know what final product you want you want from them. That's the language function. Some other examples of language function, because the edTPA asks you to identify what's one of your language functions. Are you asking students to justify? Which is very different than asking a student to hypothesize, to classify, to describe, to explain, to demonstrate, or to compare.
Can I just jump in? It is the first question under academic language. What is your language function? So you need to think about that central focus and what is your function? What is the language function? Like Stacy said, are you describing? Are you comparing, contrasting? Are you predicting? What do you want those students to do?
Right. And it's very important that we're very clear with what does it mean to demonstrate something. Because to them it might mean one thing, and to you it means something completely different. And particularly in your specific content area, it means something very specific. So that's your language function. We'll look at an example of that in a minute. Vocabulary, this is probably the one you feel most confident about, I would think. Most of you can identify the key vocabulary in your content area on any given day. Sometimes what we take for granted, though, as teachers, is that all the extra terminology that we throw out there that might not feel like new vocabulary to us today, to our students might still be unknown. So we have to be very explicit, not just about our content vocabulary, but in other abbreviations we might use, in other ways that we describe our content. That's also included in the vocabulary. You are asked in the edTPA to identify the vocabulary that you need to make sure your students are aware of in that lesson that day. but not just vocabulary.
And can I say this? If students have scored low on this, it's because that's all they did was identify vocabulary words. So it's important to have it on there, but remember, what do you want your students to do when it says that function is it describing, is it predicting, is it doing whatever? By the way, I had a student who did an edTPA about a year ago, and it was social studies, and secondary level, and the person was writing vocabulary words, and one of them was scavenger hunt. Now, scavenger hunt would not have been a vocabulary word in social studies. You know, and this is, you know, a year ago, we weren't really talking about academic language, so, you know, bear with it. It's like, okay, that's not a vocabulary word for specific to social studies, so. Okay.
But important to clarify with students in class before you would send them on a scavenger hunt, what that means. It's not your content-specific vocabulary, but important to be clear about your expectations.
And then that will get into developmental levels. If this is a group of juniors, I think they know what scavenger hunt is. If this was a group of first graders, they maybe would need to know what a scavenger hunt is. So it could be, I agree somewhat, but somewhat disagree. It's a developmental thing too, so true.
So the other things besides vocabulary, you're asked to choose one of these two, syntax or discourse, to make sure that you address. So when we say the word syntax, or when edTPA describes syntax, it's the way we organize symbols, words, and phrases together to describe, to explain, to perform in our content area. So sometimes it's sentence structure. If we are in, if we're talking about literacy, it could be sentence structure. The type of sentence structure could be the word order. It could be lengths of sentences. In math, great examples are graphs and tables. We also read tables and maps in social studies. So how do we represent our content in different ways?
Instructional strategies. You know the KWL charts, that would be one piece of syntax. So it's a structure to teach that language function.
And then the last one is discourse. And discourse is the way that we talk about or communicate with others in our specific discipline. What is unique to our discipline in the way that we communicate about it? When we think about things like, for some of us, argument, maybe in social studies, very important to talk about history in the context of one perspective versus another. Some of us in health, for example, the type of texts that we read for students to understand health is informational. We don't rely on a lot of fictional texts in health. Maybe once in a while, but very rarely. But we do need to be able to read an informational text and know what we're looking for, and that's important in our specific discipline.
For math, then, would it be more narrative because you're making up like word problems, things like that, so it would be under narrative then?
It could be if that's what if you're working on word problems, absolutely. Other things would be, other things that are important for how we communicate in our discipline. Some of you, presentations are very important. Students need to understand how to present and how to present your content area. Sometimes it's formal reports that students need to write. Sometimes it's discussions, sometimes it's debates.
Can the presentation portion of it be when you're working in a math classroom and students are maybe just having one student get up in front of the classroom and finishing a problem? Like, is that a presentation portion of it? Or how are they using, what discourse is?
The discourse would be, how do you explain a math problem in math? How is that different than how you would describe content in another area? What do you expect students to say? What vocabulary should they be using when they describe how to do a certain type of equation? What is the expectation? So that everybody in the room understands what we're talking about.
I always say when you talk to different groups, you talk in different ways. When you talk to your church group, you talk different than when you talk with your group of friends down at the, local whatever. So when you're with a group of students and you're with that content, how are you specific with that group of students? You talk differently with different contents and different developmental levels. And the questions that you have in your handbook really will try to help you along as you describe that.
In the very back of all of your handbooks, where there's a list of all of the terminology, many of you will have specific examples in each of your areas that says, in math, an example of syntax is. In physical education, an example is. So make sure you go to that section, the very end of your edTPA handbooks, where you will find descriptors that are specific to your handbook. And that might cue you in right away and say, oh, okay, well in social studies, this is how that's done. In elementary literacy, this is how that's done. So make sure you refer to that. That's another great example for you to explain the difference between vocabulary, syntax, and discourse. So let's take a look at these three areas. So we're going to watch the video, maybe not the whole thing, they're not very long. And as we're watching them, we're thinking about academic language. We're thinking about academic language. And at the end, I'll have you sort of turn to somebody near you and answer the question. The first one we're going to look at is one that probably is the most comfortable to most of us, which is vocabulary. So when we look at the first one, let's look at the ways that this teacher, what unique ways does this teacher use to teach science vocabulary?
Do is have students in pairs. I want you to identify vocabulary words. I want you to find 5 words that are difficult for you to understand. I was really interested in having students incorporate bigger segments of vocabulary into their existing knowledge. So what I like to do is have students identify the words themselves, as opposed to me standing in front of them and explicitly telling them to define this set of words. You may already know the definition of a word just by looking at its root, even though you can't pronounce it. Okay, so let's focus on the words that are just completely ambiguous to us. I take special care to tell them to use words that are of interest to them, because sometimes it may not be what you know, it may be what you want to know.
We chose this word because we understood the relative part, but not the verb part, so we wanted to find out what the first part was, so that's why I was interested in that one.
Okay, well let me stop you right there. We're going to focus more on the beginning part of the word, okay? Vulnerable. Think about the word vulnerable. By having the students find the words themselves, we're generating not just 5 words, but maybe 25 words out of a classroom that will be brand new to most of the students. Actually, that word has come up a lot in several different groups. And I think we may have talked about it in a previous class, that our bridge is a cantilever bridge, the Crescent City connection, and that's probably why it refreshed something in your memory. If we want to increase their levels of reading and writing to a higher level, that means we also need to increase the level of vocabulary. Unfortunately, a lot of high school students are technically reading below their grade level. So introducing them to a higher level of vocabulary is one strategy that we can use to increase their text complexity and their reading comprehension skills.
So turn to somebody near you and talk about the ways she uses to increase science vocabulary.
of a 3-part lesson segment, and it was only a 30-minute segment, what would you consider the language function? What does she want those students to do? What?
Identify.
Identify? What might be another word? Students will identify the vocabulary words. What else did she have them do?
Define.
What? I missed it, somebody said define. Define, explain. So you could break this into, if we said this was one of the 3 parts, so I want you to start thinking, really, this isn't that difficult. The language function could be as simple as students are going to explain what the words are. They're going to define these words. That's what she wants them to do on that day. Okay? All right, so.
Next question has to do with academic discourse. So we're going to watch a quick little video on, and see if you can figure out when she was teaching them academic discourse.
When you're having a conversation, you're going to share your answers. But you're not only going to share your answers. You're going to respond to what other people say. We've looked at talk moves quite a few times and clarifying questions. It's about learning how to participate in academic discussion. Learning how to listen to what other people are saying and respond appropriately. What's the first talk move?
I agree with what they say because...
So you can agree. Say, oh, I said the same thing as Diana. I agree with what Diana said because that was crazy when that happened. Gia Lynn, how about the second one?
I want to add on to what Brain say. I think that...
I would love to hear you adding on to people's ideas. I'll read a couple more. You can disagree with someone. You can make a connection to what someone said. You can ask someone to explain their thinking. Or you could even say, can you repeat that? I couldn't understand you. I feel like they give them a good starting point. So for the students who aren't sure of what they want to say or how they want to get their ideas out, they at least have a point and some choices that can lead them into what they want to say.
The most thing I'm interested and unbelievable is Sadukta talked and walked when he is a baby because I never see a baby talk and walk like this. I got the same answer.
Okay, so what about if you look up here at the talk moves, what can you say that again?
I have a connection to what she said. And
better. My role is to be explicit in what I'm asking them to do and also modeling ways to improve the discussion. I like that everyone's sharing their ideas, but make sure, like how Michael responded to someone else, I want to hear talk moves too, okay? Part of it's having the confidence that it's okay if they mess up. Having the starters up there so they have something to kind of lean on and a crutch.
I agree with what David say because he wants to have a better life than being spoiled.
I want them to get to a point where their conversation is more authentic and where they're engaging with each other at higher levels. Perfect.
So again, turn to somebody near you and talk about the way she taught discourse, or what were examples of discourse that she taught her students. Go ahead. to demonstrate academic discussion around a fictional text, and we just let them go, odds are they wouldn't do these things. You know, they probably wouldn't. Unless we give them opportunities to practice, we explain to them exactly what are the types of phrases you should be using when you're discussing fictional text in an academic context. Those are the types of phrases, so they have the opportunity to practice the discourse that we want them to have from day to day. She really required them explicitly to use those phrases to talk about the academic side. So the last one is syntax. So let's look at the way this teacher teaches syntax. The way we represent our discipline in symbols, graphs, tables, with words.
Hello, my name is Heather Simonik, and I teach 3rd grade at Jinx East Elementary. Alright. This lesson is called Graphing with Colors. First, we started off with the lesson by reviewing some of those concepts that we have learned before with graphing. Median, range, what a graph involves, what data is. When time's up, they have to go back to their seats. And then we talked about making a tally chart and how we can organize our data together and kind of get some totals going. What do you think I've set up here on a board? Elena? A chart. A chart. What do you think we should do it? It's not going to be our bar graph yet, so this is our chart. What am I going to do in this column, you think? Noah?
See how many blues and greens and clears.
Okay, and what we've done in the past is do tallies, and then we've given the actual number. I want you to make a tally chart with your table about how many blue you have all together, how many green, how many clear, how many red, how many yellow, all together.
6 blues and 2 greens.
That one's a little longer, so we'll just go with that. So again, turn to somebody near you and talk about examples of syntax from that video. Maybe do this with a partner and see if you can find examples of discourse, function, supports, vocabulary, syntax that are found in the glossary so that you're really clear when you walk away. When I'm talking about my particular area, this is what they're looking for. These are examples. It's not an exhaustive list. There's many, many more examples in each of your content areas. But that's one of the things that we want you to do to help you be clear on what academic language is. The last thing that I wanted to talk about today is assessment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on assessment. In fact, one of the things that I would tell you for any of the sections of the edTPA is to feel free to look at the rubrics and ask yourself, am I reaching a level 3? And that's the level, the expectation that a new teacher should be at a level 3. That means proficiency. That means ready to be a new teacher. So we're going to look at an example, one more from the teaching channel, last one, that gives an example of assessment. And as you view this video, I'd like you to rate this teacher on the rubric about how well, this is rubric 12, does she provide feedback to guide further learning. So in her assessment, do you feel like she would be at a level 1 where the feedback is unrelated to the learning objectives or developmentally inappropriate? Obviously for us a 1 is not proficient. Or does it contain significant content inaccuracies? Or would you feel like it would be a 2? The feedback's really very general, doesn't give students any specific feedback, and addresses needs or strengths related to learning objectives, but not both. Because sometimes we're really good at giving positive feedback, but we're not always good at giving corrective feedback or ways that students can improve learning. Or sometimes we go the other way. We sometimes give lots of corrective feedback and we don't give any positive feedback. So would you say she's a 3? The feedback is specific and addresses either needs or strengths? Or would you say the feedback is specific and addresses both strengths and areas to improve? That would be a 4. Or is she a 5, where the teacher describes how she will guide focus students, specific students, to use feedback to, in the future, evaluate their own strengths and weaknesses? Does the feedback that she provides really give opportunities for students in the future to figure out their own strengths and weaknesses, to continue to grow in their learning? So watch the video and think about what you would give her, and I'll have you speak to somebody near you in a moment.
Hi, my name is Leah Alcala. I teach 8th grade math, and this is my warm-up routine that I do with my students almost every day. I call it my favorite no. Okay. Good morning, you guys. Your warm-up is on the board. I'm going to hand out your index cards. I put a warm-up problem on the board, hand out index cards to all the kids, have them write their answer. I collect it, and then I sort it, and I say yes, no, yes, no. And I look for my favorite wrong answer or my favorite no, and we analyze that. 4 minutes to work on it. Everyone makes mistakes. We're going to see your mistakes, you're going to see my mistakes. But a mistake is your opportunity to share with me how much you understand. And if I don't know that you don't know something, I need to teach you before the test. The test is too late. And this is a great spot for me to teach you. Make sure your name is on your card. Put your pencil in your pencil slot and pass your cards to the center. I started my warm-up routine to replace clickers that a lot of classes are buying. So that was a clicker for each student. You ask a question, they lock in an answer. And then you look at your computer screen and you know what percentage of your students understand the problem. Well, we didn't have the money for that, so instead, okay, here we go. I thought, well, what if I gave everyone index cards, collected them real quick with their answers already written on it, and then I can just sort them as quick as possible and find out what percentage of my kids know the answer. No? Yes? Costs 40 cents instead of $15,000. Yes, so we have quite a few yeses and some very interesting no's. 1, 2, 3. I then took that a step further, something I couldn't do with clickers. 7. Look at the ones who are getting it wrong. How far are they from getting it right? And showing that work to the other kids. Okay, my favorite no. Someone wrote this. I say it's my favorite no because I want the kids to first of all recognize what they're about to see is wrong. And I want them to recognize that there's something good in the problem. Like there's mistake, but it's my favorite note because it showed some good math. So that's the wrong answer. But they did some things that I love. What in that problem am I happy to see? We always talk about what's right first, so that if it's any student's work, they are like, oh, I did do that right. There's mistake, but the mistake didn't ruin the whole thing. What do I like about this problem? Gavin?
Well, they distributed both with the 4x and the -2.
Very nice. And what? Today's lesson was on factoring. So I needed to make sure they understood how to distribute. They distributed, and what lets you know that they distributed? David?
How there are no more parentheses.
There are no more parentheses, and they didn't just drop the parentheses. So they're asked to distribute a term with a variable. They're asked to distribute twice. They're asked to distribute a term with a negative sign, which is often a very common mistake that kids make. And my students do not. Like, I have 3 years of CST data now to show that one mistake my students do not make is distributing a negative, which is amazing because they used to all the time. Distributing -2 to -6 is +12. And that was one mistake I was absolutely looking for and I did not see, which made me very happy. Not until the very end, as we've gone over different sections of the problem that are right, that I will then ask, okay, now what is incorrect? What does this person not understand? Where's the mistake? If I get a third of my class raising their hand, ready to tell me the mistake, it's pretty high engagement at that point. Yeah?
4x times 2x equals 8x squared.
Very nice. This 4x times 2x multiplies to 8x squared. Can someone convince me of that? How do we know that 4x times 2x is 8x squared? My low-level students are very engaged. They feel like they're not getting penalized for being wrong. They're not being made fun of. I'm not looking at them. No, there's no peer pressure at this point. But they're like, wow, that's my mistake. And now I understand. It's very comforting. I mean, I feel very with my kids at all times. I'm not surprised by what they don't know. They're not surprised by what they don't know. It's how it should be. It creates more of a dialogue with me and them.
So turn to somebody near you and discuss what score on the rubric you would give her for feedback.
No, I just got here, I'm sorry. Long day, but I made it.
So, Wanda and I were just disagreeing about this one. So anyway, whether or not you felt it was a good example of feedback or not. Obviously on the edTPA, they ask you to look at your focus students, which she wasn't doing. She didn't have her 3 focus students that she was giving feedback to. But you know in your edTPA, you have to focus on your specific students. She was trying to provide feedback on what students were doing right, as well as common mistakes that students have. So she was trying to get immediate feedback on whether or not students could perform that type of solving math problem and help put a stopgap between what are some of the common errors. And she talked about the fact that multiplying a negative to a negative, how by doing it this way, that she was able to virtually eliminate that common error that students have. So she spends a lot of time looking at common errors and providing feedback. So the assessment portion, make sure you're checking that out for your specific feedback. Some of you are supposed to or can provide video or audio for your assessment portion and feedback portion, and some of you, it's just the actual work completed by the students.
Okay, here's the higher order thinking question. What score would you give her for paying attention to budget reductions?
It's
fun.
Wanda, what did you score and what did Stacy score?
Wanda didn't like that example.
So, why not? But what did you, so Wanda gave her a 4 and you gave her a 5?
I don't know what Wanda would do. What would you?
Well, I was troubled with this because 12 is, if this was in the instructional task, then it would be paying attention to a lesson in action. But task 3 is the assessment, rubric 12 is about those 3 focus students, so I had troubles with this one. So don't pay attention.
Well, that was one thing that we talked about. It's not like she was looking at specific students.
Right.
And like when we looked at that rubric, we were seeing it as not thinking of the focus students, but thinking of the class as a whole. And yes, the teacher was saying, this you did right, this you did right, this is mistake, this is mistake.
Yes.
So that's why we thought she had done well.
Absolutely.
But if it was giving each individual specific feedback, then we saw it as not.
Yeah, that's what was troublesome for me. So, but absolutely. So if your supervisor was observing you using this as criteria, then I would score very high. I would score high.
Well, and I look at it this way, as the way she was delivering it, I was just trying to think if I was teaching, if that would be an effective way to give feedback. And I think with younger grades, they might not remember the mistakes they made to know if they're the ones with the right answers or they're the ones with the wrong answers. Because we were talking about that, is what if the students didn't realize if that was their mistake or not, and it's going over their heads because they thought they did it right.
Yeah, anyway. Because the ones who get it, they're going to...
So, yeah, the ones who get it know they got it right, and the ones who don't get it might have thought they did it right. So, I mean, with older grades, it probably works out good. know or would maybe necessarily recognize the mistake they made, or be able to identify that, oh, this is the right way to do it when they don't have it right in front of them.
Right. It's a cool instructional strategy. I thought that was kind of unique. I haven't seen, I mean, that was unique, but yeah. Okay.
Okay, so did you have any announcements?
Yeah, I just have just a couple of announcements before Stacy gives you the next direction. I forgot one. I came to write my notes. The one comment I want to make with you, I'm getting a little bit of feedback from your cooperating teachers, kind of through the grapevine of being kind of critical of edTPA. I remind you to take that handout I gave you the last session we were here and give that to them so they have a better understanding what edTPA is. You know, if we get on the negative side of education, we can always be there. So I really want, remember, edTPA was not something somebody just came up with nationally. It is research-based. So you need to just, you know, sometimes education gets into the naysayers and we get negative. So I really, you know, granted you may not like it because you're doing it, but you need to have a better understanding of what it is. It follows along with national board certification. So the people that are out in the field should have a better understanding of what is this edTPA and how does it align with good teaching practices. So be a little cautious with that. And if you don't know how to explain it, then give them that handout that I gave to you the last time. If you weren't here, let me know and I'll make sure I'll get it on D2 also if you want to hand that out to people. And I don't remember what the other thing was, but I'm sure it will come to me in 2 days, something, so I don't know. That's all.
So now you have an opportunity.
Oh, I know what it was. It was ASS. So how do you, I mean, ASS can stand for lots of things. Today's assignment. Stacy's going to give you directions about this. This is, remember a lot of times I say, just be professional, turn it in, don't turn it in, whatever. Today it is important that you put your name on and turn it in because there's some specific, there's nothing on that page. There's some specific questions that we're going to be looking for. Are you coming? You know, how are you doing on your tasks? So please turn it in today. Name and fill it out to the best of your ability. So I just want to share that. Samantha?
Is optional edTPA workshop on a Sunday?
What was that?
Is optional edTPA workshop on a Sunday?
Is that supposed to be?
The 16th. It should be the 16th.
Okay, I wanted to make sure there wasn't two. Sunday would be next.
Okay. So what date is
So
it?
on your sheet,
It's the 9th. What date is it?
It's 16.
it says
Oh, 16th, you're right. Because remember we have the 9th, and I think it's the 23rd is scheduled.
Yeah.
And the 16th is the optional one, so we need to have that information.
One says, yeah, the backside says.
So it's the 16th.
one thing that I definitely need to know is whether or not you are even considering having your edTPA scored by Pearson. So some of you are deciding on your own to pay for the edTPA to be scored by Pearson. And even if you're considering it, even if you're not doing it immediately, like right now, or even if you're planning on submitting a few weeks after you're finished student teaching, we need to know that. There's certain types of feedback that we cannot provide to you, and then you go have it scored by Pearson after the fact. You have to submit your original work without faculty feedback, whereas others of you who are submitting to UWRF, you could be getting certain feedback from faculty. So, so I want to know that, number 6, if you're getting it scored by Pearson or even if you're considering having it scored by Pearson. And then when we come back, I will briefly discuss submitting your edTPA. Whether you're submitting it just to UWRF or if you're submitting it to Pearson and UWRF. And I'll have a handout for you that goes along with that.
I just want to clarify, because it's not required as part of our licensure right now, if we were to apply for Minnesota license, do we have to do it through Pearson?
But other states do require an edTPA scored by Pearson, and if you're not enrolled in a program, college teacher preparation program, they don't accept. You can't just do it on your own and submit it. So for those of you who know for sure you're moving out of state beyond Minnesota and Wisconsin, or you don't know but you're pretty sure you're moving out of state, it might be a good idea, since you've already done it, to just get it scored and be done with it. And then if you move to Illinois and they say you need a scored edTPA and you now need to enroll in an approved college program to take it, then you wouldn't have to pay that again. So just something to consider, but no, in Minnesota it is required for licensure. So why don't you break up into your groups, come back up 4:30, give you an opportunity to talk over some of these items and ask questions.